Welcome to the National Press Foundation. I'm Sunny Efron, NPF's president, and today we're talking about the worsening global cybersecurity situation and the threat to our internet-dependent economies. This workshop will help journalists cover cybersecurity issues, ransomware, disinformation, and cyber conflict, and the blurring of the lines between them. Our first speaker is Vasú Jakkal, Vice President for Security at Microsoft, and she's on the front lines of America's cybersecurity battles. As always, we're on the record and taking your questions. This program will be recorded and we'll be posting an interactive transcript tomorrow or Friday. At noon, we'll welcome a panel from the RAND Corporation. Marek Passard, Todd Helmus, and Bill Marcelino will brief you on the latest research on disinformation, why it works, what the Russians are up to now, and 6 tools journalists can use to investigate suspicious online activity. And at 1:30 Eastern, we're going to have what we call a great source tutorial, where 2 experts will explain cyber for those of us who don't live in the geek ghetto. Jonathan Welburn will explain ransomware, and Tom Wingfield, who ran cybersecurity at the Pentagon during the Trump administration, will talk about cyber conflict. And we're very grateful to Microsoft and RAND for their support. So Vasú, thank you for being with us. Let's start with why the cybersecurity situation has gotten so much worse in the past year. Why are so many companies and types of targets that were never attacked before getting hit now? And what happened to the idea that hackers would not hit hospitals or other civilian targets? Even the Boston Public Library was attacked last month. What's changed?
Well, Sonny, it's great to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much for your time. So let's talk about that. Why has it changed and what is happening in the cyber threat landscape right now? I believe there are 4 contributing factors to this, Sonny, and let's look at them one at a time. The first one is with the pandemic last year, and as digital transformation continues, most businesses and consumers became remote overnight. And as we're looking at this big inflection to hybrid work, where we fundamentally, the way we live, the way we work, everything has changed. What does that mean? That means we are more digitally connected. And when you have more digital surfaces, these are more attack surfaces, because everything that is digital can be hacked. So you're seeing this proliferation in data and this proliferation in digital attack surface. So that's factor number 1. The second one is the frequency of attacks has increased. There are 579 attacks per second today in our world. That's mind-boggling. And there are attackers everywhere. There are all types of attacks because it is easy to become an attacker. There are a lot of networks and organized crime out there as well. So that's second. Related to that, when I look at how are attackers getting paid, and is this profitable, because that drives cybercrime as well. And we're seeing that there's an increase in cybercrime. Things like ransomware, which I know we'll talk in a moment, has increased pretty rapidly. It's become very, very problematic for us right now. And the reason this is profitable is you have off-the-shelf malware, you have ransomware as a service and crime as a service available, tools readily available for actors. Cryptocurrencies are changing the game as well. It's very easy now to use cryptocurrencies, which are anonymous to a large extent. And we're seeing this contribute to that profitability. So that's pillar number 2, or pillar number 3. And then lastly, let's not forget about geopolitical conditions and nation state. Attacks are getting more sophisticated. There are more nation state groups today. The rules of engagement are changing as well. First, they're limited. And I'm just kudos to everyone around the world, all governments who are working to change this. But how many consequences and risk and repercussions do you have for the attackers? So I think we need to operationalize this faster. And that makes it, all these collective factors, Sonny, are making it easier for cybercrime to spread. And the very vulnerable organizations like hospitals and humanitarian organizations and consumers and critical infrastructure are now targets. So let me carry this forward a little bit to say, so what are we going to do about it? And what is Microsoft doing about it? Because we have to, as defenders, all work together. Security is a team sport. It takes a village and we have to do our part. So these changes that I talked to you about continue to inform and influence Microsoft's viewpoint on security. And it includes 4 major points across 4 major areas. The first we talked about is, we know hybrid work is here to stay. We have to just embrace that. And that means the network, the organizational network is different. I mean, you see network attacks all the time. And as the network changes, that's going to have more exposure. So you've got to think about the network is changing. Every device, every identity, everything has to be secured. So you've got to think about security very much as end-to-end, which leads me to my second point, is there is no one thing. You can't secure a door and leave a window open. Or you can't secure 1,000 doors and have a crack in the window, because that's what the attackers are going to find. So you need a comprehensive security posture. You have to think about risk inside out. Insider risk is on the rise, alarming, unintentional, intentional, doesn't matter, but it's on the rise. You have more and more regulations. These are all inside out risks that you need to protect your assets and your data. And you need to marry that with outside in risk across healthy devices and healthy identities and threat protection, things which we probably wouldn't have thought about in cybersecurity earlier, but we need to think about that. The third one you've probably heard from us again is the move to the cloud. There are a lot of benefits to the cloud because it has the scale, it has the visibility, it has the data across many things in your digital estate, which help you secure your posture. The signal strength that we can see across the cloud is going to help us find the needle in the haystack, or sometimes I say the needle in a stack of needles that matters. And no organization can collectively match the scale that cloud provides. So embrace the cloud when you can. And finally, you've heard from us probably very passionately and a lot from the industry about a zero trust posture. Kind of a misnomer if you think of it, because you're like, how can you have trust, which is security, with zero trust? Well, because you've got to assume that. An underlying principle for zero trust is assume breach. You have to assume breaches are inevitable. You have to fortify your organization at every level, starting with great identity. So who's trying to access? What is the context of these people? Is this really Sunny or is it not Sunny? When and why are you trying to access? So really making sure that you're verifying that, making sure you give access to only the things you need access to, because there can be accidents and there can be leaks. And then lastly, having a robust assume breach tool set across all these pillars that we talked about. So as we think about all these 4 factors and how Microsoft puts it together, we recommend this approach because we have seen it work. In fact, we have implemented this during the pandemic ourselves. And even before that, through our security solutions, not only are we protecting Microsoft, but we're protecting our world across. We have 600,000 customers who trust us with us. And sometimes, Sunny, as we look at threats, we forget like all the protections that are happening in parallel. So I thought I'll just share some probably alarming stats. Last year in 2020, Microsoft protected against 7 billion attacks on devices, 30 billion attacks on email. This is a large number and talks about, again, the frequency, but I'm proud that we get to do our part towards this. And this fight for cybercrime, it's not going away, and it's going to take all of us. And with that, my closing on this before we open up for questions is, I'm just really proud to be here today with all of you. I'm a big believer in the power of the pen and the power of journalists, because you can help us so much inform people on what we need to do. A lot of cybercrime is education. You'll be surprised at how many people don't even know basic security practices. So the more we educate, the more we create awareness. I think it is very helpful for us. Things like multi-factor authentication. So simple. You have 2 factors, you do it. But yet across our own customer base, we have only 18% of customers who are using multi-factor authentication. So the more we create that awareness, Sonny, I think it's going to help us, because we're going to understand the risk. We're going to be aware of the risk. And I'll leave you with one last thing. Our chief security officer and my dear friend, Brett Arsenault, he says, often hackers don't break in, they log in. And that means, that little thing called passwords that we pay a lot of, that are icky and they're complex. Well, they're challenging because there's brute force attacks all the times on passwords. And so we are big believers in passwordless protection and making sure that you use the might of all this innovation that are happening. In fact, at Microsoft, we're almost 100% passwordless right now. And we have seen that not only increase our experiences, because it's a better experience, but also fortify our security. So this is a technology that you continue to hear a lot from us, and likely is going to be top of mind. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I hope that was helpful. And with that, Sonny, back to you for Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Vasú, for that overview. So journalists, if you're joining us just now, this is on the record. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or you can actually raise your hand, and Jeff Hertrick, our producer, will unmute you. So let me ask a couple of overarching questions first. Let's start with the cloud. We all love the cloud. We don't want to have to do this ourselves, and we get that this is defense at scale. But some experts, including some leading figures in the zero trust movement, are saying that the next front in the cyber conflict war is going to be cloud computing, that they are going to go after it and it is vulnerable. Some even say that there could be a complete breakdown of the US economy if, for example, Amazon Web Services was hacked, or frankly, the government cloud, where there's 300 million Americans' tax returns are now stored in the cloud. So first of all, granted your point that the cloud is safer than everybody trying to do it themselves, but how safe is it? And what is Microsoft doing to make sure that, Azure or the consumer services like OneDrive, where we all have our family photos, aren't the next target?
Yeah, so I can't speak to the specific scenario you outlined earlier, but I can certainly talk about the second part of your question, which is what is Microsoft doing to protect the Microsoft Cloud Azure++, because we are a cloud company. There are a couple of things we're doing, and it goes back to some of the principles that I shared with you earlier. First is the zero trust architecture. So using that as the framework and the foundation of how we do security, and a term that probably you heard from us, defense in depth. That means every single layer at Microsoft across the cloud has security in it. From the very hardware, think secure core, to firmware. We even did a recent acquisition on firmware, Refirm. To the first line of code that we write, we use security throughout. In addition to that, we're constantly monitoring security threats. So we have our own cyber defense operations center where we bring together security experts, data scientists from across the company to form a unified and coordinated defense. And a lot of the work that is done here, Sonny, also informs the solutions we build and the security that goes in our products, so we can secure our customers with that same fortification. In fact, some of the things we see which help us with this cloud security is our tools give us access to 8 trillion signals any given day. That's important because the first step towards great cybersecurity is having great signal visibility. What's happening out there? What is the movement? And then through that, we marry that up with great human intelligence. We're tracking 40 plus nation state actors today at Microsoft. We track 140 plus threat groups. We take those insights, marry that with AI, use machine learning scale, and we can get insights which are very unique. We share that with our customers and we use that to fortify our own posture. So these are a few things that we are constantly doing at Microsoft, including, of course, investing more and more to fortify our security. And you said it well, the cloud lends great scale because it allows us to patch things really quickly. It allows us to scale security really quickly. So I'm a big believer in the power of the cloud for security itself. And I'm a big believer that you have to look at security end to end, not south, east, west, with the zero trust architecture.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, we're open for questions. Please drop yours in the chat if you have one. Let's turn to ransomware for a bit. You've been very active in trying to help your clients as well as others defend against ransomware. So some of the businesses that were hurt by the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack are now suing Colonial, saying Colonial was negligent. And some insurance companies are saying that they're not going to cover this anymore. So first of all, you're in touch with all these clients every day. Are companies going to have to keep buying ransomware attack insurance, and should insurers keep paying out? And what advice would you give to companies, but also to journalists covering this, about how to cover this whole issue of the insurance industry negligence and all that?
Okay, so sorry, I'll start with just explaining what ransomware is for a bit, because there's so many definitions. So in the very simplest way, ransomware is when a cyber criminal takes over your systems. And it could happen through simple things like you get an email, you're curious about it, tax return, you click on it, and voila, there's malware, which is bad software, which gets installed on your system. They take over your system, sometimes it's data, and they really threaten you not to give access to your system unless you pay a sum of money. So going back to that profitability. And then talking about cyber insurance, so it's a complex topic and there are many aspects to it. But what I'll tell you is hopeful for me personally is that we're thinking more and more of cyber insurance as a key role and as a key part of that security posture. Because earlier we just talked about technology and we talked about human services like incident response or breach response and SOC assessment. But I do believe we have to think about how does insurance play a role in this? And every situation is different. Every crime is different. Ransomware is different as well. So you have to think about what are now the rules of engagement when it comes to insurance. One thing I will say though, as I said, and we are working with insurance companies and our customers across the board to really figure it out. It's an evolving conversation. But one thing I'll say is consistently across our customers, we hear prevention, prevention, prevention. I want to prevent cybercrime. And I think we are all alike, whether it's insurance companies or it's governments in public sector or it's private sector, and we just want to prevent the cybercrime. So largely the conversations have been around how do we do all we can to prevent the cybersecurity crimes and cyber threats. And that's where the focus tends to lean in.
So on behalf of our non-techie listeners, I want to ask a dumb question. So you talked about this need for comprehensive solutions and ransomware and how you can get it just by clicking on a link. So, and we know that there's ransomware like packages, that you can just get on the dark web. So if we can develop antivirus software to stop viruses, why can't we develop, anti-ransomware software that you can simply just download and do it? Why is, we've got an internet system that is so permeable. Why can't we just knock this ransomware out? It's been going on for quite a while now. We don't seem to be making a whole lot of progress.
What a great question. There's so many aspects to it because antivirus can protect you in some ways. And there's advanced security measures as well right now, in addition to antivirus. But sometimes it is that human element, that curiosity, which results in us clicking on things, which can then install malware. And it's hard to protect against that. And this is why we talked about cybersecurity awareness and training. And it's really difficult to even figure out, like it'll be one letter in a link that you look at that you're going to probably miss and click on it. So ransomware comes in so many ways, Sonny, and there's so many different attack vectors that it can attach itself to. And once you get in a system, you can get in a system from many ways. There are many actors who sit in the system for a long time, monitoring your activity and then act on it. It's called dwell time. The actors are in the system, in the network for a long time. So it's many points of entry and it's evolving. And that's why, it's not any one thing which can protect against ransomware. I'll also share, and I know you all know this, cyber is an asymmetric battle. It's a cat and mouse game. It's very challenging for defenders right now because it's evolving so fast and there's so many tools, as you said, it's organized crime on the dark web. And so I think that as it evolves, we will evolve as well. And we need to stay stay a step ahead, but it's a complex environment out there.
Okay. So there was a White House meeting about cybersecurity just last week. Your CEO, Brad Smith, participated along with other major tech companies. And the Biden administration, as everybody knows, has issued a national security memorandum. By the way, that can be found on our website along with some other key documents for this journalist in their resources box, and that link is in the chat. But let's just talk about the administration's response and Microsoft's response. So first of all, what were the takeaways, and what the administration has pledged $150 million, I believe it is, for enhancing cybersecurity. That doesn't sound like a very big number, given the scale of the threat that you're describing, with multiple attack surfaces and so many actors and so many different ways people can get in. So can you talk about the administration's, the overall response that the administration's doing and Microsoft's part of that, since you're a key player in that?
Yeah. So absolutely, and happy to clarify that as well. So first, I just want to acknowledge the Biden administration for doing this, because as I said, security is a team sport and we all need to come together. And this meeting was a great example and testament to it, because it was the CEOs of many large corporations, there were financial organizations, insurance companies, and then there was the government, all working together to figure out how do we fortify our defenses. So it gives me a lot of hope and a lot of heart, and a big shout out for that. From a Microsoft standpoint, we are deeply committed towards fortifying cybersecurity, and our CEO Satya Nadella was there representing Microsoft and working with all of the people there to figure out what we need to do. There were 3 aspects to the announcement that Microsoft made. So the first one was, given the scope and the scale of cybersecurity, as we talked about, we made a commitment to invest $20 billion over 5 years for cybersecurity. This is in making sure that everyone has a security by design approach, which is, all the things I was talking to you from the first line of code. So that's $4 billion a year. Part of this is also designing advanced security solutions, to the conversation we had on ransomware. Like, what can we do to continuously learn from this and keep advancing our security? So I think that's a big investment from our side that we announced. The second one, to the point you made, is we announced $150 million, and we're just going to make that available to the government so that they can help deploy. There's a lot of technology which is out there, but it's complex to deploy that technology. So this is in services where we can help federal, state, and local governments with upgrading security protection so they can use that. And then the last one is about awareness and training. We absolutely need more defenders. We have such a massive talent shortage right now in our industry. So we announced expanding partnerships, especially with community colleges, nonprofits, for cybersecurity training. So those were the 3 announcements. And then if you look at the announcement that was out there, every single company made respective announcements as well towards how do you fortify cybersecurity.
Okay, let's talk about the labor shortages for a minute, because this is interesting at a time when everyone's watching the job report so carefully. There was a very big number of jobs unfilled in the cybersecurity industry. You mentioned the role of community colleges. Can you talk about it for journalists who are looking for stories on this subject? Where should they be looking for covering this huge gap between supply and demand of workers and trained people in this area?
Oh, it's such a challenge right now, the security talent shortage. And, I would love for our journalists to cover that, because I think we need more defenders. And we're big believers at Microsoft that anyone can be a defender. You need to have the passion and the will and the desire. And also the traditional ways of learning itself are changing. We need more diversity in our workforce. Think about it, Sunny. If you look at cybercrime, it comes from all types in the world, all ethnicities, all races, all colors, all genders, all regions, all countries. So our defenders need to reflect the world that we represent. We need more diversity, because when we have more diversity and more cognitive diversity, we're looking at things which maybe you and I don't see, but someone else can say, that doesn't look right. We need to figure that out. So we have to do more. There are millions of jobs which are unfulfilled. And I think cybersecurity sometimes tends to be like this very complex topic, and people that say, maybe this is not for me. So how can we humanize it more? It's so mission driven. It's such a calling. It's the stuff that superheroes are made of. So if we can, I think, collectively elevate the need for cybersecurity, what it means, simplify it, attract great talent, have diversity, create an inclusive environment, I think that's going to go a long way for talent shortage. And I cannot emphasize and underscore a million times how important it is to get this talent. Because if we don't have enough defenders, we are starting from a position of loss. So we have to stay ahead. I think it's only going to escalate the cyber threat environment. And for that, we need great people. We need a great village. So sorry, I'm very passionate about this topic, Sani, as you probably saw. And it's just to call out to all the people out there. If you're thinking cybersecurity, choose it. We need great people.
Okay. Everybody send Vasú your resume. We need you. Oh,
Bring it
let's go
on.
back. Let's go back to this issue of the norms and the global piece where we've got, if you mentioned criminal networks on the international criminal networks, and then nation states, and then we have the gray zone nation states pretending to be kind of bands of unregulated hackers, et cetera. So when we go back to the rules of engagement, there's been a call for like the rules of the road for cyberspace. And then other people who say, what's the point of having these norms? Nobody cares. The Russians and the Chinese are not going to advance these norms. How would you talk about this? How are you thinking about this issue of developing global norms, like you don't hit hospitals, you don't take down libraries? And I ask you this as both from the state norms and private norms. Some of the ransomware hackers said, "Oh, we're really sorry. We didn't actually mean to hurt anybody with Colonial Pipeline." But obviously, real people are being hurt. It's not just virtual.
This is when you do actions, you have to think about the consequences. But let's talk about your question on the rules of engagement and what we need to do. So as I said, it's great that we have some rules of engagement, because we came from a place where we had no rules of engagement. So I think that there's progress, but we need more. So here's a couple of things which have happened recently, and even just I think last week. And for those who have not seen this yet, because it's pretty fresh, you can find this online. I think Microsoft did a blog. So just the last week, the UN released recommendations on how governments can secure cyberspace from escalating conflict. And these recommendations, I believe, are the final report from the UN group of government cybersecurity experts on how international law really can apply to state behavior online, and what we need to do for specific sectors. So as part of that, they said there are sectors such as critical infrastructure that should be just off limits to attack: healthcare, the electrical grid, education, financial services, transportation, telecom, electoral process. So they said there are international laws that apply to this. And just like those laws apply to everything, they need to apply to cybercrime. It's a great step in the right direction. At the same time, we need to operationalize this. So what we're seeing is, we talked about it. We've seen increase in attacks from everything to everything, from our food, right, meat packing factories, to oil pipelines, to aid agencies. And when my sister, who's an architect and knows nothing about cybersecurity, tells me, hey, the tile shop in our neighborhood, I think it's a cybersecurity attack, you're like, what? So there's a lot of challenges here. So we do need these rules of engagement, and we need to operationalize. Great. So now we have defined it. How do we hold true to that? How do we just make sure that we are executing to that? We have consensus. Let's say we assume that is the UN conversation. We need to now, as public, private sector countries, come together and say, what are we going to do if some of this get violated, right? How do we hold people accountable? And I think that's going to take a collective effort of our global community to ensure this happens. So great progress. It's interesting that this UN recommendation just came last week. So that I was just reading through that yesterday, and I'm like, this is great. This is a big step in the right direction. And now we need to operationalize, we need to focus, we need to do our part, we need to come together, and we need to hold organizations accountable for it.
Do you have a policy on cyber currency? One of the questions that's come up is, as long as there's a Bitcoin and ransomware can be paid in cybersecurity, there can be no accountability because it just vaporizes and it can't be traced. And the FBI, of course, famously got back for the first time some of the Colonial Pipeline ransom, but not all of it. Really, actually, I think a small amount. What's your view about this and the connection between cryptocurrencies and the lack of accountability?
Yeah, cryptocurrencies make it very easy to do cyber crime because they are anonymous in nature, and it's easy to get paid. And there are no defined rules for using cryptocurrencies or not, but it's very hard to track cryptocurrencies. So it's a great question. I think we have work to do on that front to understand, as we even think about some of these rules of engagement, like what's the role of cryptocurrency and how does that fit into all of this?
So should, I mean, you don't have to answer this for you, but if you have a policy, should publicly traded companies be allowed to pay in cryptocurrency? Should they be allowed to pay ransomware? Is this a question, the way you're thinking about this, is this a question for Congress? Is this a question, obviously the courts will weigh in, but, do we need to have a ban on simply, major companies paying in cryptocurrencies to put a stop to this? Because no one company can do it alone, right? You talked about it takes a village and the need for collective action. What other, is that a viable opportunity? And if not, what other kinds of collective action should we be talking about and should journalists be looking into as a response?
I think collectively we need to explore this and we need to understand all the facets of it. And if we want to enforce something, we need to evaluate, like, how do we do that? Because it's large, it's complex, and I think this goes back to the conversation we were having earlier on the rules of engagement. So what role does this play? And I'm going to have to think through it a bit more for this response, but I do believe that we need to explore it.
Okay, so reporters in local areas who never covered cybersecurity before are now going to have to report on their local companies and industries and employers getting hit with this and what they're individually, going to do. And of course, once they're hit, it's, often too late. I hear about prevention. Is there a trusted reporting system for hacking? Because we hear that many companies that are hit with ransomware or other cyber attacks try to keep it quiet. They don't want their shareholders to know about it. They don't want their customers to know about it. In some cases, they go public. In some cases, they quietly pay through cryptocurrency or some other way. And I guess maybe there'll be a footnote in an SEC filing, 2 years from now, but right now we don't know about it. How are you looking at that? You talked about having AI and looking at the whole threat landscape, but can we really see what's going on when there's so many individual attacks and people paying off attackers quietly?
We said this last fall when we had the SolarWinds Nobelium breach. Microsoft was at the forefront of that. We became the front line of defense. And Brad Smith, our president, put this out. A, it was a moment of reckoning for our industry when security companies are being targeted. B, we said, it's going to take us to share information. And it's, to protect ourselves, we have to know what we are facing, right? And so the more companies share, the better it is for our community. And we need to change the way we think about cybersecurity and cyber attacks as well. We need to give kudos, like when the Colonial Pipeline CEO came and talked about it, kudos. It's so hard to do, and been in those rooms. It's very emotional what you go through. It's very challenging because cybersecurity is not just a financial cost, it's a very human cost to what we go through. And so, just acknowledgement to the companies who've come out there and shared, because that makes us better. Now we know we can use that, we can use those techniques that attackers are deploying. And I do believe that as we look at technology scale, the more we learn, it goes into the system, and then we can help identify and we can help fortify. Also, I think, Sonny, going back where you started, where you said reporters are going to have to cover local news, I think that's a great thing, because sometimes it's as challenging as it is, you care more about your neighborhood fire than you care about a fire which is happening across the world in a completely different state, right? So if there's a fire in a neighborhood in Australia, it's, you don't feel that impacts you as much as if there's a fire in your own zip code. That's why local coverage is so important. And that's why we need to create awareness. And I just think it's awesome if we can cover that from a local perspective, because people are going to be more vigilant. They're going to take steps to protect themselves. So I think that's a really great call out. And I think that's a really great movement.
Well, thank you so much. Vasú, while we're going, could I ask you for a second to close the blinds on your window? Because your light is going, flashing up and down. Nuts. It's a little hard to see you. Sorry about that.
Is this better?
Yes, that's better.
Oh,
Thank you
sorry
very
about
much.
that. I know the sun just decided to shine on my face today.
Of course, it's everybody's waking up in Pacific time. For those of you, I see some new folks have joined. Please feel free to ask your questions of Vasú Jakkal. You can drop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we will unmute you and try to call on you. So let me go back to this question of the role of journalists in raising awareness. And everyone likes to say that, but obviously many journalists will say, you know what, we write these stories all the time and people still use 123 as their password. But there's also this attitude that I think surfaced partly with the T-Mobile hack that happened, I guess, 2 weeks ago. A lot of Americans believe there's no privacy online anyway. All their data has already been harvested or stolen. It's already on the web. Antivirus software doesn't stop them anyway. So like, why bother? If you're a consumer, you can't possibly defend yourself. You're dependent on other companies, companies and providers to defend you. And, you've been advocating, you said earlier, this alarming statistic that only 18% of your own customers use multi-factor authentication, which clearly is necessary. But in the T-Mobile hack, people were saying, well, gee, MFA really won't help because now you can have SIM swapping because they've gotten people's SIM numbers, which are now on the dark web. And so everybody's, cell phone can be spoofed. So can you talk about this role of consumers and what consumers ought to be doing where there isn't really perfect security?
Yeah. The truth is there's no single answer for that, because security will always be a multi-pronged approach. And so you have to do what is available and start there, and multi-factor is there. It's something you should do. You have to have two-factor authentication. If you have your email or if you have your social media accounts, if you haven't done that, get two-factor authentication. It's the first layer of defense. Is it going to be enough? It won't be enough, but it's a great first layer of defense. And then I think this is where the collective responsibility of defenders comes in, is as we evaluate new hacks coming in. Sometimes it's links, sometimes it's brute force, sometimes, as I quoted our CISO, it's passwords, they're just doing password spraying. So all of these are defenders are looking at how can we protect more. So going back as an example to the password list, we figured that, you brought it up. I'll tell you, like, that's who I used to be, right? Like, you're just like, how am I going to remember all these passwords? So you go naturally to some algorithms, and these algorithms can be easy to break because they're doing password spraying. There are machines which are just generating passwords. So password list now fortifies it. So it's a step at a time where you have to think of what are all the tools available. And there's so many tools that are already available to us that we don't use. Let's start there, let's fortify that, and then keep going. Also, like for organizations, sometimes it is, we talked about patching. It can get in the way, right? You get a patch, you're like, I'll handle that later. Do it. It may take 20 seconds, but it has better security for you. So that's the call out for consumers I'll do is, everyone's trying very, very hard that security does not get in the way of experiences and innovation. In fact, that's a big focus, making security simplified and beautiful and elegant and modern. But we all have to do our part in updating our systems as consumer, in creating awareness with our children. How many times in schools, Sunny, do we teach about cyber health and cybersecurity awareness? And yet my kids are online all the time, working and learning and playing games. So I think there's a lot we need to do from a consumer standpoint, a family safety standpoint, children safety standpoint, and techniques like multi-factor authentication, techniques like updating your systems when that patch comes in are important ones. And then as we stretch that across organizations, making sure that defenders are continuously innovating as well. And we are using new techniques like we talked about password list is going to help us. So I don't think there's ever going to be like that one magic pill where you just do this one thing and you're protected. I think it's going to be more like a toolkit that we need to use. And again, I'll keep repeating the zero trust architecture. That's why it really matters, because it helps you look end to end.
Okay. We have an interesting question here from a journalist in Ghana who says, issues about cyber are relatively rare or unreported in my country, Ghana. As a journalist who wants to veer into reporting on such issues, what should I do?
Oh, what a great question. And thank you for joining us. And of course, I want to see the next report in Ghana now. How amazing. So I think there's a lot you can do, starting with just basic, what is cybersecurity? Because it'll be surprising for people to understand how much we have been challenged by this. And there's sometimes curiosity can create great readership. So what are some of the headlines and making it relevant to people, right? I think one of the challenges I see in cybersecurity is we use very technical terms. And as an average consumer reading it, they will not understand it. And when you don't understand it, you feel like it's for someone else. How many times have we done that? We're like, I don't understand this. And maybe for a different reader if I'm not understanding. So I think what you can do in Ghana is make it relevant for your audience, telling great stories about how hacks have happened and what were the implications of it. Gosh, we would love to see defenders from there. So are there people, talented, amazing, people in Ghana who want to choose cybersecurity as their profession? I think that there's so much you can do from that aspect, and it would be so wonderful to have coverage there.
Thank you so much for that. So from where you're sitting, what stories aren't being written in the US press or the international press that you think ought to be written? What headlines do you wish you would see in the next 6 months?
It's a fabulous question. So there are a couple of things. First, I just want to say kudos to our journalists, because the fact that we have awareness right now is what happens in the news. So it's just great that we have coverage. I mean, cybersecurity has become top, right? It's at the top of the pyramid, and we're doing work that is helping, even though sometimes it may feel like, gosh, I take 5 steps forward and then something happens and I feel like there's no progress. But please be heartened, there is progress. There are organizations working through it. And I think this is the collective village coming together, and you play a big role in that. The places I think, Sonia, that I would personally love to see coverage is, these inside out risks. So we talk a lot about cyber threats. We talk a lot about hacks coming from the outside, but there's also insider risk, there's data risk, there's data loss. I would love to see coverage on that, because sometimes it can be that disgruntled employee, or sometimes it can be an unintentional leak that I think we need to be aware of, and how do we fortify that. So would love to see that. The second thing I would love to see is, and I think this comes to the very human nature of cybersecurity. It's always great when we see headlines on breaches and what's happening, and it creates awareness. But there's so much work, good work that's happening in cybersecurity. There's so many silent heroes, so many superpowers that work every single day tirelessly, and they do not get any limelight. So I would love for our journalists to find those silent heroes and who are working and who have prevented stuff, and do some docu-series and things on that, because I think that will go a long way to address one of our biggest challenges, which is attracting talent. We all want to be superheroes, right, in our hearts, and when we hear about other superheroes and we see it, we can be it. So I would love for us to do stories around how cybercrime has been prevented. What have we done? Who are these people humanifying cybersecurity? And lastly, very selfishly related to that, I think on diversity, the more we show how diverse talent helps, the more we show how security can be that inclusive place where we all belong and we can do our greatest work and our greatest calling. I think around that, there's some just great stories to be written there to make our world a safer place.
So your point about heroes is very interesting, because journalism in general is talking a lot about solutions journalism and writing about what can be done as opposed to it's hopeless. And yet in the cybersecurity realm, some of the best scoops are really the whodunits, and the whodunit is often, an evildoer. And the evildoers get a lot of ink. I'm thinking back to, I guess it was 2013, the Cummings case. He was the first insider. You mentioned insider threats, and he was eventually indicted. I don't know whether he was convicted or whatever happened to him. But there were a lot of profiles on who are these, who are these hackers? Who are the Snowdens of the world? Who are the evil geniuses who breach it? And very little about the defenders.
Yep. And that's why I think it's great to talk about the evil geniuses or the evil that was behind the attack, because that creates awareness, right? So you just know, hey, that's the profile, that's what I need to be aware of. So I see where that comes from and appreciate that. And the reason I flag the defenders is we need to highlight these heroes, because when we hear these stories, they can be extremely inspirational. And boy, they work hard, Sunny. They work really hard and really tirelessly. So if we can cover that and say, how are you catching that evil? How are you catching cybercrime? I think that can also help us strengthen our defenses. That can also help us, be it and inspired. And I feel the next big chasm is this talent that we're going to face. And we need to show that there's hope and light and freedom and inspiration and empowerment in cybersecurity. And that's why, as I said, very selfishly, I would love to read stories of people who are the heroes, like the catching all the cybercrime and how they have thwarted it, because I think then that balances the equation as well.
That's interesting. In the medical coverage, journalists do write about medical superheroes, but we don't write about really cyber superheroes. Are there examples? And in fact, you can tell us this later if you can't think of anyone off the top of your head. Are there examples of diverse and unknown people who are superheroes in the cybersecurity realm who aren't getting any ink?
There are so many, and I can get you the list. I can't think of the top of mind. I won't do justice to it if I just say a few names. There are so many, and there are organizations now which are coming up and recognizing that. I was part of this recently at Black Hat. We had a Cybersecurity Woman of the Year celebration, and so I got to be part of that, and it was wonderful, because otherwise, we wouldn't be recognizing these incredible women in that case, who have been doing so much great work. So there are so many cases, there's so many examples, there's so much diversity there, and from all countries, from all walks in life. So I think there's just I can't wait to read those stories. There's some really inspirational stories to be written, books to be written about it too.
Okay. And let's talk about U.S. media coverage some more. So we talked about what you want to see. What does the coverage of the narrative on cybersecurity get wrong? When you read the press and you go, oh my God, that's a bad story, or not, you don't have to name names, but I wish people knew X. If the reporters only knew Y, they'd write a better story. What are the things that frustrate you that you think is wrong in the coverage when you read it, or uninformed?
It's not so much about frustration. As I said, I'm grateful that we have coverage. I'm grateful that people cover. I think the challenge sometimes is that it's such an evolving screen, for lack of other words, right? It's just evolving really fast. So we work with the facts that we know at that time, but they may not be the full facts, because even people across all are figuring it out. So I guess I would encourage people just to keep on it and to really ask questions and to look at the full facet. That's great journalism, right? So you all do it as well. But like looking at the story from all angles, I'd say it's an elephant in the room. And sometimes you can just see the front and sometimes you can just see the back. But we need to tell the full story. And that full story can take time. It can take time. And I think we work in this world of instant gratification more and more, where everybody wants to just know everything at one time. So there's a lot of pressure on our journalists to get that story out. But I think if we keep on it and we can look at the full story and figure out the facets, and then I think that helps us, because now we have more more factual elements of it as well. So I would say it's not a frustration. It's just like, it's hard sometimes to even get that. And we all need to do our part to share the full story and get the full story.
Okay. You mentioned the fact that everybody's busy, journalists and consumers alike. Let's talk about the busyness factor as it relates to cybersecurity. So you mentioned clicking on links and ransomware getting in. You get a link and you click. All of us are clicking on links many, many times a day, right? And our kids are doing the same. And how are you supposed, if you're an ordinary human being And if you're a journalist trying to write a story about this issue, what do you tell people about which links to click and which links not to click? And how can journalists sort of help the consumers through this? Because we're making these decisions in a split second about what we're going to click on or not.
Yep. So there are two that I think there are three. First is for, as we find these links, for the defenders to share that, right? Because that's one. Second is for the journalists to report it so people can see it. And then third is for the consumers to read it so they can create awareness. I'll give you a story which I think was one of my favorites. So a few months back, Microsoft reported the Nobelium, the same actor who was behind SolarWinds, was running an email phishing campaign. Super interesting. There was a lot of coverage on it. And they were sending these emails, right? And it was from the government, but it had like President Trump's picture in some of them. And so, you look at, it creates curiosity and you click on it. But what we did was we published a lot of that in a blog so that people could see exactly the link which was coming, what was the email, right? What was the headline? Another favorite story was when COVID happened last year, and there were a lot of COVID related crime, and people were getting these emails. You remember when the checks were going out and people were getting relief? And so it seemed very similar. You're like, wow, there's a COVID relief thing. You click on it. And so people, security companies started publishing that because you're like, look for this, right? ABC, there's like a exclamation in between. I mean, it's so subtle, which can be the wrong link. So that's the first step, is as we uncover, we need to make this available, and we need to highlight that with like a big circle, like this is the link, this is where it's breaking. Then the journalists need to report that, Sonny, because we need to make that front and center, that this is happening. Don't click on these links. Here's what's going to happen. But it's not complete. Like, we all can say all this till a consumer reads it and acts on it. And this is where I think cybersecurity training really comes into being, because we can, report all this and say this, but if people are not reading and not acting on it, it's going to be hard. And that's where the relevancy for yourself comes in. It's like, it's going to impact you. And we need to just make sure that we pay attention to that. So I think those are the three prongs. And the more we are very specific and we are very clear about what is happening and what can you do, like in this case, call to action, do not click. It's like simple like that. I think it's going to help us. Like, that's what I did with my kids, is do not click on emails that you do not understand. And now they're just so terrified. They come to me and say, which emails do you want to click on? So the only ones that come from mom. But no, I think we all just need to be super cyber aware.
Okay, so let's talk about another consumer weak link, passwords. You talked about passwordless access. Can you tell us what that is? Do you guys have a fob? How do you do what is passwordless access?
Thank you for asking that, because sometimes even I use jargon and then I'm like, I should have explained it. So password means, you're typing in, right? You have letters and words and combination. Passwordless means you're not really typing it, and the system can recognize you in different ways. So biometrics is one, fingerprinting, facial recognition, tokens. They're all different ones in which, sometimes like you have systems where you click on something and they say, I'm going to send a verification link, and then you get a code, and then you put the code in. There are pins that are generated. So there are many techniques for doing passwordless, but the very idea is you don't have to remember a string of things, which it can be hacked, or you forget it, or you have the same thing for everything. And you have different ways in which you can enter your system, log into a system, which uses many different techniques.
Okay. Biometrics. Back to my original question, if Americans are just cynical at some point that everything's already been hacked. So those of us who have had security clearances, our fingerprints have been hacked in the OPM hack. So people are reluctant in some cases to use facial recognition or to use biometrics, because once that's hacked, that too can be sold on the dark web. What do you say to people who are afraid of that?
I understand the concerns. And this is why, going back to what we said, it's not any one thing. Have two factors where it's a fingerprint and something else. And, through that, you'll be able to have higher level of defenses, because now you don't have just one link to enter, you have a combination of factors. And I think that's a great way to strengthen defense.
Okay. How about the commercial aspects of our data that's public or on the dark web being used by marketing companies? I'm thinking about the British firm
Cambridge
Analytica, that they didn't steal anything, and yet people felt very violated by what was already public. So this is, there's the cybersecurity issue of how they get it, but then there's the issue of what's already out there, what they've already got. How can consumers protect themselves in an era where so much has already been compromised and is floating out there for use by marketers, state actors, criminals?
Right. So the internet, when it was born, was designed to be anonymous. I mean, if you think of the internet evolution, who would have thought the internet is going to be used in the ways we use it right now? Even e-commerce was such a foreign concept. I'm just dating myself now, but when it was really born. And I think that is one of the reasons, like, it's evolving. And with privacy as well, the privacy laws are evolving. And what gives me heart is there's a lot of work that's been doing from a consumer privacy standpoint, where we are all, as organizations, as Microsoft do, working on how do we really protect privacy? How do we have the right approach to privacy, from everything from, policies and constructs and to responsible AI and all of these, right? Again, it's like all things, it's not just one facet. So there's work that needs to be done, but there's also work that's been already done to make sure that what may be a marketing campaign, we think of it and we don't think about privacy issues when we're designing it's positive intent. You're thinking of, now I have a product, I want to market that, I want to take it to these 10 people, and you may not traditionally have had, like, how is this going to be breached, or privacy. I think we've come a long way in educating that even if the intent is incredibly positive, it can be misused in this ways just by nature of it. And so what do we need to do, whether it's tools and techniques and technologies, it's practices, it's mindset, it's culture as well, to protect privacy of consumers? And I think there's a lot of work that's being done, and there will continue to be a lot of work that's going to be done on this frontier.
Okay. Last call for questions out there before we let Vasú go and start her day. Anyone have any more questions? You can put them in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, last question. And this is a toughie. If you were advising the White House now, or you were advising any other foreign government, doesn't have to be the US government, on how to really hold people accountable, what would you tell them to do? I mean, we're going to have a discussion later today with Rand Experts. Welcome to Bill Marcelino, who's just joined us, about the question of what happens when we hit back. What if we punish ransomware or other cyber attackers, then we open ourselves up. Can you talk just a bit about how you're thinking about accountability in the state sense and punishing?
The way I would approach this, Sonny, is that it's not going to be any one government, any one organization can do this. And we need the collective force of across the organization. That's why the steps that the UN is doing is, I think, very important, because it starts first with just defining rules of engagement. What's in, what's out, how do we discuss that? And then from that, accountability has to be across the board, from the tools we develop to what we put out there to how are we going to hold threat actors accountable? How are we going to catch them? Who's going to enforce that, right? If it's someone from a different country, like, who's responsible for holding them accountable? And it's so complex, our data flows. If you go to a physical person, goes to a country, you have a passport, you verify your identity, you go through that. But if it's digital world, data comes from anywhere. So I think that's where I would start is, how do we understand this landscape and what do we need to do? And through that, being very clear on the responsibility scope and who's going to hold what responsible is where I would start.
Well, Vasú Jakkal, thank you so much for being with us and answering a lot of tough questions. We're going to take a short break and we will be back with RAND experts shortly. Marek Prasad, Todd Helmus, and Bill Marcelino. Thank you so much. Welcome. We'll be back with them shortly. Vasú, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you so much for attending. It's just been great. Such a treat, such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.